Well, I promised a few weeks ago that we would wrap up our sermon series on the festivals. We will get to that before Pentecost because I want to make sure to get that information to you so you can more fully appreciate the holiday, the Christian holiday of Pentecost. But as I was praying this last week, I really felt like God wanted me to touch, at least for a few weeks, on the idea of being a disciple, being a follower, being someone who is walking with Jesus in such a way that we actually reflect Jesus. The term Christian was actually originally a term of mockery or derision given by the enemies of God's people. And it literally meant a little Christ. And so the original believers, shortly after Jesus had resurrected and gone back into heaven, took that as a badge of honor rather than as an insult and said, yes, that's exactly what we want to be. We want to be an image, even if it's in a small way, of what Jesus was like, so other people could see what it looked like to be around Jesus, because they couldn't see Jesus at that point. So all they had to see were the disciples. There's a reference in the Psalms. David talks about how it's important to taste and see that the Lord is good. And the concept there is that there's an experience that we have when we are with those who embody the Spirit and the presence of Jesus that we would not otherwise have. You know, it's different to say that an apple is delicious than to actually bite into it and taste it and experience it for yourself. And what God's goal is for each and every one of us is that we would be so filled with the life and the love and the presence of Jesus that when people come into contact with us, they get a little taste of what Jesus was like when he walked on this earth. That's what it means to be a disciple. That's what it means to be a worshiper. And so the title for our message today is being a worshiper, being a disciple of Jesus, to live as Jesus lived. Now, contrasting that with how the Jews themselves were living when Jesus came on the scene, the Jews of Jesus' day had 613 different commandments, different laws that were pulled out and recognized specifically from the law of Moses, those first 5 books of our Bible today. And there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of additional prescriptions and descriptions and regulations and rules that over the centuries the Jewish leadership had added to those 613 different Jewish laws, to the point that people were weighed down. There was no possible way that people could live out, even remember, let alone live out everything that was being put on their plate. And Jesus comes along in our passage today, and he basically brings all of those things down, distills them down to 2 basic commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says that's all of the law and the prophets. If you want to take everything and distill it down, all those 613 laws that you people are promoting and all the different books and books of descriptions and rules and regulations that you say flow out of those, none of that matters as much as those 2 realities. When we love the Lord our God with all our heart and mind and soul, and love our neighbor as yourself, he says, you're fulfilling it. You've done it. You've accomplished it. Now that is much more simple than having all those other things to memorize. I didn't say easy. It's simple. It's often very difficult to live that out in practice, right? To love our neighbor as ourselves and to really love God with all of our heart and mind and soul. Today I want to spend some time just helping us think through concretely what it may mean, what it may look like to love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul. And I wanted to give us all an opportunity this week to reflect on how we might cooperate with Jesus in doing that to a greater degree. So let's take a closer look. What does it mean to love the Lord our God with all of our hearts? I love what Paul says in Colossians 3:1. He says this, "Since then you have been raised up with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God." Setting our hearts is incredibly important when it comes to the things that we love. We have a negative example of this at the very beginning of the Bible when we look at Adam and Eve. How was it that the devil tricked or convinced Adam and Eve to rebel against God? He wanted to set her focus on something that God had not asked her to do. And so the serpent, we're told in Genesis, got her looking at that forbidden fruit and tried to convince her that this really was something that she needed, that she wanted, that was good for her. And the more that she set her focus on that, the more that her heart began to be focused on that, until she came to a point where she reached out and took it. And that really is a powerful lesson for all of us about the nature of setting our hearts. When we set our focus on something, it begins to grow in our hearts. And so it's incredibly important that we really pay attention to what we're setting our attention, setting our focus on, because that will inevitably be the thing that we are pursuing, or multiple things. God says, Jesus says here, He wants us to set our hearts on things above. In other words, set our hearts on the things that God wants for us, on God Himself, that God would be the object of our love, our affection. Because if we set our hearts and our focus on Him and His desires, then we will naturally begin to pursue everything that Jesus wants for us. If we don't, then we will begin to pursue other things. It was really interesting because as I was preparing this message this week, I noticed that in my own life. There were different situations that cropped up this week where I began to get distracted, began to just have thoughts in my mind about, I really want this, or I really want to pursue that. And I started to reflect back at different times in my life. Just by way of example, I'm a board game lover. I love games. I love to sit down and play with folks. And I find it's a great time to connect with people and have fun together. And we do family game nights a lot of times. And I found that I really enjoy getting new games because it creates a new experience. And I want to kind of create that fun and that atmosphere for friends or for family. But the downside of that is I can begin to set my heart on it. And not that long ago, there was a new game that was coming out, and I was looking at it thinking, that just looks so good. It looks really fun. I think that'll be amazing for the family. And I got so fixed on it that I was going to purchase it, and I felt like God just gave me a nudge at that point and reminded me, hey, you've already got plenty of games. You could take any one of these other ones off the shelf and sit down and play that with a family. Do you really need to spend another $50, $80, whatever the cost was? Or could you use that money for something else, for me? And I took a step back and I thought, yeah, that really is true. I just need to not worry about that. I don't have time enough to play the stuff that we have, let alone get new stuff and keep getting new stuff. But it's just important for us to pay attention sometimes to those things that go on inside of our hearts, inside of our minds, because we get so easily distracted and pulled away from setting our hearts on things above, setting our hearts on the things that God has for us. John has this to say. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God will live forever. You know, so often in our culture, everything is built around focusing us in different directions because people want us to buy their product or pursue a certain thing or go to get the latest fashion, whatever it may be. And we need to be very careful of that, very mindful of what's going on around us. Let me phrase some of the things that John says, perhaps in a little bit more modern language. A craving for entertainment, the latest experience or the latest physical pleasure, doing what we want, when we want, and with whom we want. Having a desire for all that money can buy, a greed for pursuing the newest and the best. I don't know when the next Apple iPhone is coming out, but you will hear about it, I'm sure. Because every year and a half, the latest version comes out, and it's so much better, of course, than all the older ones combined. And they push, the advertising pushes people just to get the newest and the best and the latest version. But do we really need that? A craving to succeed and to look and to feel important to others based upon what we own or what we have accomplished. John says all of these things are of the world. And if we set our hearts on those things and we begin to pursue those things, he says what we will get is the fruit of that. Because this world is passing away. But if we pursue the things of God, those things will last forever. Let me just, before we move on to looking at our soul, ask some intrusive questions. I've also asked these of myself this week. What is our heart set on? What motivates us? What gets us excited? What causes us to jump out of bed on our day off? What do we pursue? What do we choose to spend our time and our money on? And how do these point to the true object of our affections? Is it really a loving God with all of our heart, mind, and soul? Or are we loving someone or something else? It's important for us to reflect on those things. What does it mean to love God with all of our soul? Now, typically we think of soul as something spiritual as opposed to physical, right? Something esoteric or maybe beyond our physical reach. But I really love what author and theologian Wendell Berry had to say about this. I'd like to read this quote to you from one of his books. People often conclude that the biblical formula for man-making in Genesis, when God made Adam and Eve, is humans equal body plus soul. But that conclusion cannot be derived except by violence from Genesis 2:7, which is not dualistic in this way. The formula given in Genesis 2:7 is not man equals body plus soul. The formula there is soul equals dust plus breath. Now think about that for just a moment. God took the dust of the earth and He breathed His Spirit into that and made human beings. He says, according to this verse, God did not make a body and then put a soul into it like a letter is put into an envelope. Instead, He formed man of dust, and then by breathing His breath into the dust, made the dust live. The dust formed as man and made to live did not embody a soul, but became a soul. That is, a whole creature. The concept there is that when the Bible speaks of our soul, it's speaking about all of us, not just the spiritual part. Our body, our mind, our actions, our words, everything that makes us us is our soul. Now this body will eventually fade, and God says He'll give us a new body, but the essence of who we are will remain forever, either with God or apart from God. And so the soul represents everything that we are. What then does that look like for us to love God with all of our soul? Just in my own mind, this may not be totally accurate in every way, shape, and form. But to break this down for me, I wanted to clarify that in three ways. Our words, our attitudes, and our actions. So if we're loving God with our attitudes, the Bible says, have this same attitude that was in Jesus. In other words, be like Jesus in the way that you approach life. Sometimes we have a bad attitude. Just because of what's going on around us, we choose to allow the situations and circumstances in life to drag us down. But Jesus never did that. You know, Jesus was sad, Jesus was angry, Jesus was frustrated. I don't mean that. But ultimately, His attitude was one of continuing to press through, focus on what God has me to do, and continue in that direction with love and joy and ultimately peace. His attitude was not shaken by situations around him because he continued to focus on God and who God was. Words. Ephesians 4, Paul speaks a lot about words, and I just want to highlight some things that he talks about because I think it's really helpful for us. He talks about positively giving thanks on a regular basis, speaking truth. You know, when we speak truth in a loving way, we are loving God with our soul. When we are encouraging others, speaking things that build them up. Now that could be even potentially a criticism, as long as it's a constructive criticism, delivered with the intent to help people really grow. Is it with love that we're sharing those things? Paul says speaking kindly to others, speaking words of forgiveness. He also says in Ephesians 4, things that we should avoid with our words. Do not lie, he says. Don't speak rashly when you're angry. Too often we speak words that we wish we could take back, but it's too late. He says be really careful of that. Don't speak words that are insulting or attacking to other people, he says there. Don't speak with the intention of to cut other people down or to bring them down, to make them feel stupid. Don't use words that express rage. Don't slander other persons. Now, Paul doesn't say this, but I would add not even politicians and lawyers. That's a temptation sometimes, but we're supposed to speak positively about other people. And he says, don't involve yourselves in coarse joking or rude joking. Don't use obscenities, he says. So as we are using our words in ways that God wants us to, we are literally loving God with our souls. The final thing that he talks about here is loving God with our actions. Now, I love the idea behind the golden rule. How many have heard the golden rule before? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, unfortunately, so often in our society, that's been sort of flipped a little bit, where people essentially take it as do to others what they've done to you. In other words, we're reacting to what other people have done and then use that as a justification. Well, they did it to me. I guess that's what they wanted. But Jesus here is saying the opposite. As believers, as Christians, if we are loving God with all of our soul, we are not being reactive to other people. We are being proactive. In other words, no matter how other people treat us, we are still treating them the way we wish they had treated us, the way we want them to treat us. So our actions don't depend on what other people do. They depend on what Jesus would do. And that may be kind of a worn out phrase, what would Jesus do? We've heard that for years. But in this case, it really is true. You know, God wants us to be reflective in how we are choosing to respond to others. Not react, but to respond. In spite of how they may treat us, He wants us to treat them the way Jesus would have. The way we wish they would have treated us. Because He says that will break the cycle. It will change the dynamics in relationships. And so the golden rule helps us understand what it means to love God with all of our soul. Final thing, loving God with our minds. I love the Greek term here that is used in this passage by Jesus, dianoia. It's a really interesting word in the Greek language. It's not one that's easy to translate. So I want to give you sort of a basic definition of how the Greeks looked at this idea. It is to use one's mind in a thorough yet balanced way, examining evidence from all angles in order to reach a meaningful personal conclusion that will then be translated into action and life. So in other words, if we are loving God with all of our minds, we are not checking our brains at the door, no matter what situation we're in. We're not just taking things at face value, no matter what side is telling us what. We are actively engaging in listening, in understanding, in reflecting before we say, before we react to any of that, or before we make a decision. And then we are taking those things to God and we're saying, okay, God, what is your perspective on this? Now let me just give you a quick biblical example of this. Paul, after he had become a Christian, because he had been reacting and he was persecuting the church and attacking the followers of Jesus because of the things that he had misunderstood. When he finally converted and became a true believer in Jesus, he began to go out and preach the gospel. And what he experienced among many of the Jewish people was the same thing that he himself had first kind of reacted with. A real negativity, an animosity even, and they began to attack and persecute him. But he came across one group at a city called Berea that did not act that way. And he was amazed because these folks took everything that he had to say and they went back to the Scriptures and they began to look very deeply. Rather than just reacting, oh, that's not how I grew up, that's not what I've heard before, that's not what I'm hearing from these other people in the media, whatever it may have been. They didn't just react. They took everything that he had to say and they didn't accept it immediately. They took it back to the Bible and they began to study it and check to see where that all fit together. If he was really right, if they had misunderstood things in the past and now they needed to rethink their positions. And what they found was they did. They had been taught one way, and then when Paul came along and challenged that, rather than just rejecting him outright, rather than just accepting it willy-nilly, they thought through and they studied and they reflected and they discussed it until they came to the conclusion, this really is God. We've had it wrong all this time. And now we see what God is really trying to say. That is loving God with all of our minds. Not just accepting what people say initially and going with it and then allowing ourselves to be carried along with it. But to really stop and ask, God, is this really from you? Is this right? What is your perspective on this? And then going back into the Bible and finding out what God has to say. So loving God with all of our heart, mind, and soul. That brings us today to our time of communion. And I think appropriately. As I reflected on even the last few weeks from this perspective, I realized I'm not measuring up, Lord. There have been too many situations where I heard something about someone or about a situation, and rather than loving you with my mind, I just reacted. And I didn't really try to get your perspective on it. And I didn't approach that in a balanced way. Or my words didn't measure up to your standard. I spoke something negative about people instead of positive. I didn't have my focus. I didn't set my heart on you, Lord. I apologize. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. So maybe as we've gone through this today, you've touched on some of those things. You felt God nudging you and saying, hey, I love you, but I want you to even do better. Come along with me. And we have the opportunity today to come to the Lord and just confess where we've failed and allow Him to pick us up and take us by the hand and move forward into more and better with Him. The beautiful thing about Jesus is He never leaves us hanging. We have the promise in the Scriptures that God will give us the strength and the wisdom that we need to continue to go in the right direction. So all we have to do is have a desire. And sometimes we don't even that. There's another prayer that Paul gives us in Philippians that he prays, God, give me the will to do as you will. So even when we don't have the desire, but we know we should, we can pray that and God will help us even in those things to choose what we need to do and do the thing even when maybe we don't want to. As we reflect on that reality, let's come today to remember, as Jesus called us to. Jesus, when He gathered with His disciples in the upper room before that moment that He was arrested and eventually taken to the cross, said to His disciples, behold, this is my body, which is broken for you.